YouTube, I think one of the biggest problems society faces today is loneliness. In this story I'm about to tell you of Thomas Quick, he confessed to over 30 murders, which essentially classed him as a serial killer. But when authors and those intrigued by his story took a deeper look, they realized maybe he didn't commit any of these. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. I'll tell you the story of Thomas Quick, and then in the comments I want you to tell me, why was his loneliness so bad? Why would loneliness drive someone to do this? If you do end up liking this video, please subscribe. Now in the 1990s, Thomas Quick, he confessed to more than 30 murders, making him Sweden's most notorious serial killer. Then he changed his name and he confessed that his previous confessions were all faked. He confessed to over 30 murders and was convicted for 8 of them. Now the name of this alter ego was Thomas Quick. He, Thomas, was being held in Säter. I don't know if I'm saying that properly, but Säter is a mental hospital in Sweden. A lot of the information I provide to you are from therapy sessions that he had during his time there, and he claimed while he was there that he had maimed, assaulted, and eaten many of his victims, the youngest of whom was a 9-year-old girl whose body has never been found. So in the 90s, Thomas confessed to one unsolved murder after another, becoming, in the words of the father of one of his alleged victims, a ghost who ran through Scandinavia, killing more than 30 people. The sadistic murderer was a media sensation, and his bespectacled face stared out from front pages and television screens. The newspapers, they called him the cannibal, and Sweden had their very own Hannibal Lecter. But then in 2001, he stopped cooperating with the police. He withdrew from public view and he changed his name back to his birth name. And then in 2008, Hans Rastam, one of Sweden's most respected documentary makers, became intrigued. He visited the former Thomas Quick, now known as the Bergwall, at Säter, this mental institution, trawled through the 50,000 pages of court documents. They went through the therapy notes, the interrogation notes, went through doctor's notes, and Hans came to the startling conclusion that there was not a single shred of technical evidence of any of Bergwall's convictions. There was no DNA traces, there was no murder weapons, there wasn't any eyewitnesses to any of the confessions that Thomas had made. And just to reiterate, Thomas and Stur, or Bergwall and Thomas Quick, it's all the same person. And during this investigation that Hans did himself, he understood that most of Thomas's confessions came whilst he was under the influence of narcotic strength drugs. Confronted with Hans' discoveries, Bergwall admitted the unthinkable. He said he had fabricated the entire story. So Hans Rastam was looking at writing a book, and he wrote a book called Thomas Quick, The Making of a Serial Killer. And in the book, Hans Rastam, he unpicks the painstakingly detailed way in which the deeply troubled Quick was able to gain key information surrounding each case from psychiatrists, police officers, and lawyers, before cobbling together the rambling and confused testimonies into a coherent narrative that could stand up in court. In other words, Thomas, who found out about these cases whenever he spoke to police officers or psychiatrists, whenever he got information, he connected the dots and he made up a story. And the purpose of this video is to figure out, well, why? Why do this? Now, Jenny Kutim, who was Han Rastam's researcher for 3 years on the story, was appalled by what they found. She said, the worst part is that because of people not doing their job, there are a lot of killers out there who never got caught or faced justice. But again, why would a man confess to such sadistic crimes if he was innocent? And when Hans spoke to him in Säter, in the hospital, Thomas said that his motivations were that he wanted to belong somewhere. He felt lonely in life. He had no purpose. I was a very lonely person when it all started. I was in a place with violent criminals, and I noticed that the worse or more violent the crime, the more interested someone got from the psychiatric personnel. I also wanted to belong to that group, to be an interesting person in here. So, from that, we can gather that he had been in a mental institution for a while, and then he learnt that he could become famous. People can get to know him. People could be interested in him. People would want to know, what's your name? Where are you from? Why do you do this? Who are you? Whom are you? Where are you from? For once in his life, he figured out that he could get the attention that he craved. And I find that the sense of belonging, I find that Like, that does not surprise me. I think what does surprise me is the length he was willing to go. But throughout history, we've all wanted to belong to something, whether it may be our favorite sports team, maybe just friends in general, or maybe clubs that we would go to back in high school days or university. But we all have a sense of wanting to belong, to be a part of something. It was said that Thomas, while he was in high school, he always wanted to fit in, but he was quite the teenage misfit. He grew up in a small town in Sweden, one of 7 siblings raised according to strict Pentecostal beliefs. He describes himself as a creative and ambitious child, interested in theatre and writing. But at 14, he realized he was gay, and he was too ashamed to go and tell his parents in fear of what their reaction might be. He then started experimenting with drugs. Amphetamine was his favorite. And then at the age of 19, he was accused of molesting adolescent boys. Later, he tried stabbing a former lover. Then in 1990, he tried robbing a bank to help pay for his addiction. The clerk recognized him. He was incarcerated inside a hospital for psychiatric treatment. Not a stable individual then, but not a serial killer at least. Also, when Thomas was speaking to Hans, Thomas said that when he was in high school, he thought of himself as quite an intelligent person, and he wanted people to take him seriously. And I myself, I've been in these shoes. I've been in a situation where I have something to give to the world, but people don't take me seriously. That's one of the reasons that drives me with my YouTube channel, right? People looking down on me. It seems people look down on Thomas, and his motivation or what he wanted in life was to be acknowledged. And in a sense, perhaps in confessing to these crimes, in becoming famous, so to speak, maybe he was getting revenge on those who just ignored him. And I've always said, it's better to be hated than to be ignored, because if you're hated, then people acknowledge you exist. And it was when he was in this mental institution, Satar, that he realized that he could speak to psychiatrists, he could read up on psychiatrist books, and perhaps learn more. This would help him get the attention and acceptance that he craved. See, for Thomas, it was in 92 that gave him this idea. In 1992, he was seeing a therapist, and he asked the therapist, what if I told you I'd done something really bad? What if I was actually a serial killer? And because the therapist was interested in this, the therapist was intrigued by this, it gave Thomas an idea. See, if you think of the scenario, Thomas, he tells his therapist, hey, I murdered someone. The therapist isn't going to let that go. The therapist isn't going to chalk that off as just, in the moment. The therapist is going to ask, is going to probe. The therapist is far more interested now in what Thomas is doing and what Thomas had to say. And this reaction gave Thomas the idea, well, if this is a therapist, imagine the world. So the first alleged murder Thomas Quick confessed to was that of Johan Asplund, the victim of one of the greatest criminal mysteries in Swedish history. Johan was an 11-year-old boy who went to school one day in November 1980 and disappeared. His body was never found. In a series of therapy sessions and interviews with the police, Thomas claimed that he saw Johan from the school and picked him up. He took him into his car, took him to some wooded area, and then he assaulted him. Thomas said that his motivations were he just panicked, so he took the life of the boy, and then he decided to dismember the body so nobody could find it. And despite forensic technicians being called onto the scene, nobody at the time could find the body. In fact, it took 9 years for prosecutors to cobble together a case against Quick. He was finally convicted of Johan's murder in 2001, but by that time, Quick had already been found guilty of 7 other killings. And I can imagine during these interviews that Thomas in his head was probably laughing his ass off. He's thinking to himself, these dumb motherfuckers are gonna go and look wherever I tell them. I've got their attention now. They're listening to me. They just so happen to believe me even though I'm quite the crackpot. And again, he's thinking to himself, well, if this is the most important people relevant to this case, the police officers and the forensics, if this is them, well, if I tell this on a mass scale, imagine how much attention I would get from everyone else. Essentially, you could argue that Thomas was playing in the attention economy. His job was to keep people believing his story for as long as he can. For example, if he was a YouTuber, his entire video would be trying to keep people to watch the video as long as they can. And judging by the looks of this story, if Thomas was a YouTuber, he'd be big. Yet, oddly for a serial killer, there was no obvious modus operandi. Thomas killed children and adults. He assaulted men and women. He used an array of weapons and committed murders in various parts of Sweden and Norway. In 1996, he confessed to the murder of 9-year-old Therese Johansson in Norway 8 years previously. Thomas told the police that the girl was blonde and she was from a nearby area. However, when the police did their research, they found that she actually had brown hair and she was raised in a newly urbanized city. Thomas' lawyer, Thomas Olsen, said he described a totally different situation in all aspects, but instead of accepting that, they went on with 15 new interviews. Thomas Olsen, not to be confused with Thomas Quick, but Thomas Olsen was a lawyer that was brought on to help Thomas Quick once he retracted all his confessions. Thomas Olsen had a reputation for taking on difficult cases. With his swept back hair, bristled face, and chain smoking habit, he is precisely the kind of person one can imagine playing the role of a campaigning Scandinavian lawyer in a film. And when Thomas Olsen was interviewed himself, he was asked, did he believe that Thomas Quick was dangerous? Did he believe that Thomas was capable of all this? And he simply said, no, not at all. He was asked, do you like Thomas Quick? And Thomas Olsen said, I don't really like people in general. I certainly know that feeling. Thomas Olsen went on to say, but of course, if you spend enough time with someone, you get to know them a little bit more under the surface. And this was the case of a little innocent boy who grew up with your usual Christmas trees, but then eventually became a victim. After confessing to the murder of Therese Johansson, Quick was driven to Norway. The TV camera followed his every move. He was rapidly becoming one of the most famous men in Scandinavia and reveled in the attention. When Quick claimed that he threw Therese's body in a nearby lake, Norwegian authorities spent 7 weeks trying to clean it. For a while they found nothing, but then eventually a bone fragment was found, and because of this, Thomas was convicted, even though it was later found that this wasn't a bone fragment, it was just a charred piece of wood. Even more curiously, he appeared to have a cast iron alibi for some of his crimes. Although he confessed to killing a teenage boy in 1964 at the age of 14, it turned out that several witnesses could remember seeing him at Holy Communion with his non-identical twin sister some 250 miles away. In fact, there was a photograph showing him there. When he claimed responsibility for killing a 23-year-old woman in Norway in 1985, he said he had sex with her despite confirming his sexual preference for men. The police found traces of sperm, they conducted DNA analysis and confirmed that this wasn't Thomas Quick. And yet the courts once again found him guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. And I guess the game going on here is Thomas just wants to be famous by any means necessary, and the local authorities in Norway or in Sweden, the police just couldn't be bothered to deal with it. A lot of these may have been cold cases where they had no leads and they just wanted to get that conviction on their books. A man comes along, says, yeah, I did it. And they were like, okay, well, you know what? Fuck it. We'll put him in jail and we can close the books on this one. But there were some defenders of all these bogus verdicts, and they pointed out that Quick had revealed telling pieces of information from each of the crimes that only the killer would know. In fact, Judge Goran Lamberts, who conducted a week-long review of all the cases in 2006, said after reviewing these cases they were all above board. Lambert said that there is no DNA or fingerprints, and the evidence is not as strong as it could be, but there is evidence that sort of fits in. He gave a lot of facts about the two murders in particular with Johansson that fit so well with what actually happened and what kind of children these two were. But according to Thomas, he said, well, all this information was readily available to the public. When he was in hospital in his younger years at this mental institution I mentioned, he was allowed to go on day leave. So Thomas would go to the Royal Library in Stockholm and he'd read up on old cases in newspaper articles. Thomas noted down the telling details in contemporaneous reports, the positioning of the body, the specifics of the landscape, the victim's clothing, which he would later reveal in therapy as Thomas Quick. So when he was doing the research, he was his real name, Ster Bergwell, but when he started to tell his confessions, tell his stories, that's when he was Thomas Quick. His therapist would praise him for his bravery in digging deep into his remembered past. The police would be thrilled at the emergence of a credible suspect for a previously unsolvable crime. On at least 2 occasions, Quick was flown by private jet to take part in reconstructions at murder sites. All the time, Quick was basking in the reflected glory like a praised child. Thomas said that he didn't need to do much. Whenever a crime took place, he would just get the newspaper articles, he would read 2-3 of them, maybe speak to a police officer if he can, hey, what's going on with this case, put 2 and 2 together, and then essentially bullshit his way to a confession. And if you look at the private jet, the special treatment, the reenactment of the crime scene, even though the police at that time are like, well, you did this, you're going to jail, so why don't you tell us how to do it? The notion of him being at a crime scene and conducting this alleged murder was thrilling enough for him. Now, during his therapy sessions and a lot of his police interrogations, he was actually given a cocktail of drugs. I know the drugs were benzo, whatever the fuck that name is, so I'm just going to put it on the screen. I tried saying it 4 times already, I just couldn't say it. Medical records show that he was given multiple tablets daily, including 20 milligrams of diazepam. A high dosage given to those with poor impulse control can lead to a release of inhibitions that could explain why Thomas was able to invent such a grotesque litany of cannibalism, assault, and murder. And at the time, he remembers being enamored by depictions of fictional serial killers. In fact, in the hospital library, he was able to borrow the book American Psycho, which is not the book you want to give to someone in a mental institution. The drugs were very important, Thomas said. I had free access to them, and I relied on them to get me into a condition where I could tell stories and make them up. So the question is, what kind of effect did these drugs have on him? Thomas went on to say, a lot happened inside of me. I'd get high, I'd get a kick, and then I'd have lots of fantasies. My imagination would run wild. In one sense, they gave me a lot of creativity. It was like a vicious circle. The more I told, the more attention I got from therapists and the police and the memory experts, and meant I also got more drugs. During the course of many investigations and questioning sessions, Thomas mentioned at least 24 different places where bodies were buried in both Sweden and in Norway. He said in these locations he had committed murders, handled dead bodies, and dismembered them. And despite all of this, there wasn't a single trace of any body or any blood linking back to Thomas. Many psychiatrists have theorized that with Thomas, he had repressed extremely traumatic memories, which resurfaced in the form of dreamlike sequences that could often be littered with inconsistencies. It was only through repeated therapy sessions with trusted confidants and the administration of calming drugs that the real narrative could emerge. Jenny Kutum, who was a writer in Sweden, when she came across this story, she went on to say, he was a mental patient in a mental institution. Thomas was the only one that did not have a job. Are you telling me there was nobody in this institution that could have just said, no, we don't believe you? Jenny also went on to say that because of this, you can't really blame Thomas for what he did because the people around him should have done their jobs. However, you can blame Thomas for all the pain and suffering he brought to the victims' families. Speaking of the families, Bjorn Asplund is one of them. He was the father of a missing 11-year-old boy who was the subject of Thomas's first confession. Bjorn goes on to say that he was very popular in school, just a great kid, when speaking about his own kid. His dream was to become a farmer. Asplund and his ex-wife Anna Clara, in 1993, they were told, well, there's this mental patient that you've never met, and he has confessed to abducting and taking the life of your child. And Bjorn himself, he didn't believe it at the time. Bjorn knew that whenever a child's life is taken, more often than not, it is taken by those close to the family and not just some random person off the street. Thomas to them was unknown. In fact, the Asplunds were convinced they knew who did it. An ex-partner of Anna Clara who wanted to seek revenge for the breakup of their relationship. And there was actually enough circumstantial evidence for Bjorn to get his lawyers, and this ex-partner was actually jailed for 2 years, but then was freed. And despite this man's freedom, who was released from jail, and he only spent 2 years in jail for kidnapping, despite all this, Bjorn knew this was the man that took the life of his son, not Thomas Quick. For every murder Thomas confessed to, he was subjected to an average of 10 to 15 police interviews. When he claimed he killed an Israeli backpacker, Yenon Levi, in the Dalarna woods in 1988, Thomas was asked repeatedly what murder weapon he had used. In interviews, he mentioned a camping axe, a spade, and a car jack, among other items, before finally alighting on the right object, which was a wooden club. In court, Thomas' indecisiveness was glossed over. It was stated simply that he had correctly identified the murder weapon. For the victims' families, the prolonged nature of each investigation was extremely distressing. And Bjorn, the husband of Anna Clara, in court he was forced to once again listen to what happened to his boy. And even though Bjorn himself knew that this confession was quite skeptical in any walk of life for anyone to speak to him about what happened to his son, fictional or non-fictional, it was always going to be a painful listen. Thomas claimed that he ate Joanne's fingers. He then cut off the child's head and kicked it like a soccer ball. And for Bjorn, this just confused him even more. Back then, you were allowed to smoke cigarettes in the courtroom, and he just kept smoking back and taking a drag of his cigarette as Thomas goes through everything he did with his child. And as I said, Bjorn, knowing Thomas was full of shit, just couldn't handle it, and he felt betrayed by the police and the prosecution. In 2001, a new clinical director at Satur reviewed Thomas's medical records. He was shocked to discover the dosage, and Thomas's supply of drugs quickly dwindled. Once he stopped taking them, he stopped confessing. And this is when he told police and journalists, "I'm no longer cooperating with you." Eventually, in 2013, Stur Bergwell was released from the Satar Medical Institution. Upon his release, most of his treatment plan remained confidential, but it was revealed that at that time, Bergwell no longer needed to take psychiatric medication, which suggested he had fully recovered. So it seems, in a way to get attention and for people to know his name, he lied about a whole bunch of killings. What crime is that? Leading the investigation astray, perverting the court of justice. But I don't think the crime itself is the issue. I think the issue is how pathetic and alone, how depressed and desperate, how on the inside, how was he so empty that this was the only way to make him feel happy? We're never going to understand the decisions other people make. That's why sometimes in real life, I don't even try to. I guess this was just a case of another lonely person who just took it too far. Idle thumbs. They are one of life's biggest problems. Why don't you guys comment? Tell me what you think.